This video is part of a long-form exploration of the psychological work of Carl Jung. Rather than simplifying these ideas or turning them into techniques, this series approaches Jung's work as he intended it to be approached, slowly, seriously, and in-depth, allowing the ideas to unfold rather than be summarized. Long before the persona becomes a problem, it is a solution. It is important to understand this, because the persona is often treated as something false, shallow, or deceptive. In Jungian psychology, that judgment misseth its origin entirely. The persona is not created to lie, it is created to survive. Carl Jung used the term persona deliberately. In ancient theater, the persona was the mask worn by the actor not to deceive the audience, but to make the role visible. It allowed a voice to carry, an identity to be recognized, a function to be performed. Psychologically, the persona serves the same purpose. It is the part of the psyche that mediates between the individual and the social world. It answers a simple but unavoidable question. Who do you need to be in order to belong, function, and be understood? From early childhood, the psyche learns this answer through experience. Certain traits are rewarded, others are ignored, some are punished. The child does not consciously decide to form a persona. The process is instinctive. The psyche adapts to the environment by emphasizing qualities that secure attachment and suppressing those that threaten it. This adaptation is not pathological. It is intelligent. Without a persona, social life would be impossible. There would be no stable roles, no shared expectations, no reliable communication. The persona allows the individual to move through the world without constant friction. It provides coherence. The problem begins only when coherence is mistaken for totality. Over time, the persona tends to solidify. What was once flexible becomes habitual. What was once situational becomes identity. The ego begins to identify not only with the persona, but as the persona. This is where confusion enters. The individual no longer asks, "What role am I playing?" They assume, "This is who I am." At this point, the persona ceases to be a tool and becomes a boundary. It defines what is acceptable, visible, and permitted not only to others, but to oneself. The psyche narrows. This narrowing is often praised. Society rewards consistency, reliability, and predictability. A person who embodies their role well is seen as mature, successful, or stable. But psychological stability is not the same as psychological wholeness. Behind the persona, aspects of the personality that did not fit the role remain alive. They do not disappear. They wait. These rejected or neglected elements do not necessarily consist of negative traits. Often, they include spontaneity, vulnerability, creativity, assertiveness, tenderness, or ambition, qualities that were once inconvenient or unsafe. The persona protects the individual from rejection, but it also protects the individual from themselves. This protection comes at a cost. As identification with the persona deepens, inner life becomes increasingly disconnected from outer life. The person performs competence while feeling empty. They enact confidence while experiencing doubt. They maintain order while feeling internally fragmented. This dissonance is rarely dramatic at first. It appears as fatigue, as boredom, as a vague sense that something is missing. The ego responds by refining the persona further. It becomes more polished, more controlled, more aligned with expectation. Success may increase, approval may grow, yet the inner split widens. Jung observed that many people who appear socially adapted suffer inwardly from a loss of vitality. They are functional, but not alive. Their lives make sense, but they no longer feel meaningful. This is not because the persona is false. It is because the persona has been overused. The psyche cannot live entirely on the surface. When inner life is excluded for too long, it begins to press for recognition. The first signals are subtle: irritability, restlessness, loss of enthusiasm, unexplained sadness. These signals are not failures. They are communications. They indicate that the persona, while necessary, is no longer sufficient. The task at this stage is not to destroy the mask. That would be chaotic and irresponsible. The task is to recognize it as a mask or role that serves life, but does not define it. This recognition requires courage, because it destabilizes identity. If you are not only the role you play, then who are you? The ego resists this question, not because it is wrong, but because it threatens coherence. The persona provides safety. To loosen identification with it feels like exposure. Yet without this loosening, psychological growth cannot proceed. The persona must remain flexible, conscious, and limited. It must be worn lightly, not fused with identity. Only then can the psyche begin to reestablish a relationship between outer life and inner truth. This relationship is not comfortable, but it is alive. And aliveness not, performance is what the psyche ultimately demands. The persona develops where the individual meets the group. It is shaped not by inner truth, but by social demand, by what is expected, rewarded, tolerated, or admired within a given environment. This is why no one has a single persona. Each context calls forth a different adaptation. At work, one set of traits becomes dominant. In family, another. Among friends, another still. This flexibility is not deception. It is competence. Carl Jung understood social adaptation as a psychological necessity. Human beings are not solitary organisms. Belonging is not optional. The psyche is organized around relationship, recognition, and shared meaning. The persona allows this organization to function, yet adaptation always involves selection. To belong somewhere, certain aspects of the personality must be emphasized, while others are minimized or excluded. This selection happens early and often unconsciously. Over time, it hardens into habit. What fits is expressed. What does not fit is withheld. At first, this feels like maturity. The individual learns when to speak, when to restrain emotion, when to assert authority, when to remain agreeable. Social life becomes smoother, conflict decreases, approval increases, but every adaptation carries a cost. What is consistently withheld does not disappear. It accumulates. The psyche keeps track of what has been sacrificed in order to belong. This is why people often feel most of themselves in private alone, or with those who place no demands on performance. It is also why prolonged exposure to environments that require constant self-monitoring leads to exhaustion. The cost of belonging is energy. Maintaining a persona requires vigilance. The individual must monitor tone, expression, posture, language, and response. This monitoring becomes automatic, but it never becomes free. When social adaptation dominates inner life, the psyche begins to experience itself as divided into two zones. The part that functions outwardly, the part that lives inwardly. If these zones remain connected, the tension is manageable. If they drift apart, something breaks down. This breakdown often appears as burnout. Burnout is not simply physical fatigue. It is psychological depletion caused by prolonged identification with a role that no longer corresponds to inner reality. The individual continues to perform, but the performance no longer feels voluntary. What once felt chosen now feels compulsory. The ego responds by trying to optimize adaptation. It becomes more efficient, more professional, more agreeable, more controlled. Ironically, this intensifies the problem. The persona grows stronger as the inner life grows quieter. This quiet is dangerous, not because it is calm, but because it is muted. Muted inner life leads to reduced imagination, diminished emotional range, in a sense that one's actions no longer carry personal significance. Life becomes procedural. One moves through days competently, but without depth. Jung noted that modern societies, with their emphasis on productivity, visibility, and consistency, strongly reinforce this pattern. People are encouraged to define themselves by function, title, role, output, identity markers that can be recognized and validated. This validation feels reassuring. It is also narrowing. When the persona becomes the primary source of self-worth, the individual becomes vulnerable to external evaluation. Praise inflates. Criticism devastates. Change threatens identity itself. The psyche becomes fragile precisely where it appears most composed. This fragility often goes unnoticed because it is masked by success. Only when the role is challenged through failure, transition, or loss does the underlying instability become visible. At that moment, the individual may feel strangely empty. Without the role, who am I? Without the function, what remains? These questions feel frightening because they reveal how much inner life has been outsourced to social structure. The persona, meant to mediate between inner and outer worlds, has replaced the inner world altogether. Social adaptation is not the enemy. Unconscious over-adaptation is, when adaptation becomes automatic, unquestioned, and total. The psyche loses its capacity to correct course. It continues performing even when performance costs more than it gives. The first step toward restoring balance is not rebellion. It is awareness. Awareness that belonging always extracts a price. Awareness that no role can carry the full weight of identity. Awareness that inner life requires space beyond function. This awareness does not immediately change circumstances. It changes orientation. The ego begins to recognize that the persona is something it uses, not something it is. This recognition loosens the grip of external demand without dissolving responsibility. Belonging no longer requires disappearance. It requires negotiation. And negotiation becomes possible only when the individual acknowledges the cost of adaptation without romanticizing withdrawal or idealizing isolation. The persona must remain connected to inner life if it is to serve rather than drain it. Otherwise, the price of belonging is paid not in effort, but in loss of self. Burnout is often treated as a problem of workload. Too many hours, too many demands, too little rest. While these factors matter, they do not explain why some people collapse under conditions others tolerate, or why rest alone often fails to restore vitality. From a Jungian perspective, burnout is not primarily a problem of energy. It is a problem of misalignment. Carl Jung understood exhaustion as a message from the psyche, not merely a physical limit being reached. When the ego is overly identified with the persona, life begins to require continuous performance. Energy is spent maintaining an image rather than expressing a reality. This kind of fatigue is different. Sleep does not fix it. Vacations do not resolve it. Motivation techniques do not reach it. Because the source of the exhaustion is not effort, it is encumbrance. The individual continues to act in ways that no longer correspond to inner truth. Decisions are made according to expectation rather than necessity. Speech reflects what is appropriate rather than what is alive. The persona functions efficiently, but the psyche withdraws support. Burnout emerges when the inner world stops participating. At first, the signals are subtle. A loss of enthusiasm, a dulling of emotional response, a sense of distance from one's own actions. The ego interprets these signs as weakness or lack of discipline. In response, it often doubles down. More control, more structure, more effort. This escalation accelerates the collapse. Jung observed that when inner life is excluded for too long, the psyche forces a correction. If meaning cannot be expressed consciously, it withdraws unconsciously. Energy drains away to prevent further distortion. Burnout, in this sense, is protective. It interrupts a pattern that would otherwise hollow the personality. It forces a pause when reflection has been avoided. It confronts the ego with a question it has postponed. Why am I doing this? This question is not philosophical. It is existential. People in burnout often report a strange ambivalence. They are exhausted, yet unable to stop. They resent their roles, yet feel empty without them. They long for relief, yet fear what will remain if the performance ends. This ambivalence reveals the depth of identification with the persona. The persona has become the primary source of structure, validation, and meaning. To step away from it feels like psychological freefall. The ego would rather endure exhaustion than face the uncertainty beneath the role. But the psyche will not cooperate indefinitely. As burnout deepens, the body often becomes involved. Sleep disturbances, chronic tension, illness, or anxiety appear. These symptoms are not random. They are expressions of a psyche that has been ignored. The message is consistent. This way of living cannot continue. Jung did not see such breakdowns as failures of character. He saw them as failures of relationship between ego and inner life. The persona has taken precedence over the totality of the psyche. Recovery, therefore, cannot consist solely of rest or role adjustment. It requires reorientation. Reorientation begins with listening to what feels dead rather than forcing enthusiasm, listening to what feels necessary rather than socially rewarded, listening to resistance instead of overriding it. This listening is uncomfortable. It destabilizes identity. It reveals how much of life has been organized around appearance rather than authenticity. Yet without this discomfort, burnout returns. Some people resolve burnout by changing environments, others by redefining roles, some by loosening standards. These changes help only if they are accompanied by a deeper shift. The persona must once again become a means, not a center. The ego must stop asking, "How do I perform this better?" and begin asking, "What part of me has been excluded?" Burnout is not cured by efficiency. It is relieved by integration. Integration does not mean abandoning responsibility or rejecting social life. It means allowing inner life to inform outer action again. It means restoring dialogue between who one appears to be and what one is becoming. When this dialogue resumes, energy returns not explosively, but steadily. Burnout fades not because life becomes easy, but because life becomes aligned. The persona remains, but it no longer carries the weight of the whole psyche. And when that weight is redistributed, exhaustion loses its necessity. Burnout has done its job. It has forced the ego to listen. A persona can endure strain for a long time. It can absorb pressure, suppress contradiction, and adapt to expectation with remarkable efficiency. But it cannot carry the whole psyche indefinitely. When the distance between inner life and outer role becomes too wide, the persona begins to fail. This failure is rarely dramatic at first. It appears as subtle inconsistencies, moments when the role no longer fits, when speech feels hollow, when actions feel oddly disconnected from intention. Over time, these inconsistencies accumulate. Carl Jung described this process as a collapse of adaptation. The mask that once enabled functioning loses its credibility, not in the eyes of others, but in the eyes of the person wearing it. This moment is deeply unsettling. The persona has provided orientation, status, and predictability. It has answered the question, "Who am I in the world?" When it begins to crack, that answer weakens. The ego feels exposed, uncertain, and unprepared. Persona collapse often occurs at points of transition, a change in career, a loss of role or recognition, a life stage that renders old adaptations obsolete. It can also occur internally without any visible change. A person may continue performing successfully while experiencing a growing sense that the performance no longer corresponds to anything real. This produces anxiety not because the role is failing, but because it is empty. The ego, sensing instability, attempts to repair the persona. It becomes more rigid, more polished, more controlled. Image is refined. Standards are tightened. Vulnerability is reduced. These repairs may work briefly, but rigidity accelerates collapse. A persona that cannot adapt loses its mediating function. Instead of connecting inner and outer life, it blocks communication between them. The ego becomes trapped inside a role that no longer breathes. At this stage, people often describe feeling like an imposter, not because they lack competence, but because competence has replaced authenticity. They are doing what they know how to do, but they no longer know why they are doing it. The psyche responds with resistance. Motivation declines. Imagination dries up. Emotional range narrows. What was once effective becomes mechanical. Jung did not see this as pathology. He saw it as a necessary disruption. Persona collapse forces a confrontation the ego has postponed. What remains when the role no longer works? This question feels dangerous because it threatens social coherence. The persona is how one is recognized, valued, and understood. Without it, the ego fears rejection or irrelevance. But the deeper fear is not social. It is internal. Without the persona, the ego must face parts of the psyche it has long ignored. Traits that were once inconvenient return. Desires that were suppressed reassert themselves. Questions that were deferred demand attention. This is why persona collapse often coincides with emotional volatility, irritability, sadness, anxiety, or sudden shifts in values may appear. The ego feels destabilized because its primary structure of orientation is failing. Yet this destabilization has a purpose. The psyche is attempting to restore balance by loosening identification with the mask. It is creating space for inner life to re-enter consciousness. This re-entry is not orderly. What returns first is often what was most excluded: anger in the agreeable, vulnerability in the competent, dependency in the independent, creativity in the disciplined. These returns can feel humiliating. They can also feel relieving. For the first time in a long while, something is alive. Persona collapse exposes the cost of over-adaptation. It reveals how much of the self was traded for stability, how much spontaneity was sacrificed for approval, how much inner truth was deferred for coherence. The task at this stage is delicate. If the ego clings to the collapsing persona, it hardens into cynicism or despair. If it rejects the persona entirely, it risks chaos and social disintegration. Neither extreme is viable. What is required is differentiation. Differentiation means recognizing the persona as a role rather than an identity. It means allowing the role to exist without demanding that it contain the whole personality. This recognition restores flexibility. The persona can be revised. It can be loosened. It can be worn consciously rather than compulsively. Persona collapse, when approached reflectively, does not destroy social life. It humanizes it. The individual becomes less impressive, perhaps, but more real. Jung believed that authenticity is not found by discarding masks, but by refusing to confuse them with the self. When the persona collapses, the ego is offered a choice. It can rebuild the mask more consciously, allowing inner life to inform outer role, or it can rebuild defensively, repeating the same pattern under a different name. The psyche will respond accordingly. Collapse is not the end of adaptation, it is the end of unconscious adaptation. And that ending, while painful, creates the conditions for a more honest relationship between who one appears to be and who one is becoming. When the persona is over-identified with something subtle but profound is lost, inner authority. The individual no longer asks what feels right. They ask what works, what is expected, what will be accepted. This shift does not happen overnight. It develops gradually as external feedback replaces internal orientation. Carl Jung did not use the modern term false self, but he described the condition with precision. It arises when the ego organizes itself almost entirely around adaptation, performance, and approval, while inner life is treated as secondary or irrelevant. The false self is not deception in the moral sense. It is over-functioning adaptation. The individual becomes extremely good at reading situations, anticipating expectations, and adjusting behavior accordingly. They appear competent, composed, even admirable. Internally, however, something essential weakens. The capacity to say no erodes. Desire becomes confusing. Values feel interchangeable. The ego loses its ability to distinguish between what is meaningful and what is merely effective. This loss creates a peculiar form of dependency. The person becomes reliant on external signals to know who they are and how they are doing. Praise produces relief. Criticism produces disproportionate anxiety. Silence feels threatening. Without feedback, the false self falters. This is why periods of solitude often feel uncomfortable for those who live primarily through the persona. Alone, without mirrors, the ego encounters an unfamiliar emptiness. There is no clear sense of direction, only a vague unease. The false self fills this unease with activity. Busyness replaces reflection. Productivity replaces purpose. Stimulation replaces depth. These substitutions keep anxiety at bay, but they do not restore authority. They further distance the ego from its own inner signals. Jung observed that when inner authority is lost, moral decisions become externalized. Right and wrong are determined by consensus, rules, or ideology rather than lived understanding. The individual behaves correctly, but without conviction. This is dangerous not because it produces immorality, but because it produces disconnection. Disconnected individuals are easily swayed. They adopt beliefs quickly and discard them just as fast. They feel righteous one moment and empty the next. Their identity shifts with context because it lacks an inner anchor. The psyche compensates for this loss. Often, compensation appears as sudden rebellion. The person may act out impulsively, contradicting their established image. These actions are rarely integrated. They feel foreign, even shameful, and are quickly suppressed. Alternatively, compensation may appear as numbness. The individual feels flattened, emotionally distant, unable to access enthusiasm or sorrow fully. Life feels muted, as though observed from behind glass. Both responses signal the same problem. The ego has surrendered its inner compass. Restoring inner authority does not mean rejecting the persona or abandoning social roles. It means reestablishing a dialogue between outer life and inner necessity. This dialogue begins with attention to irritation rather than dismissing it, attention to boredom rather than medicating it, attention to attraction rather than rationalizing it away. These signals are not instructions, they are indicators. Jung believed that inner authority emerges when the ego learns to take these indicators seriously without acting on them blindly. Authority grows through reflection, not impulse. The false self weakens reflection because it prioritizes reaction. It responds immediately to external demand, leaving no space for inner consultation. Reclaiming authority requires slowing down. It requires tolerating moments where no clear answer appears. It requires resisting the urge to perform certainty. It requires accepting that inner truth often emerges gradually through contradiction and ambiguity. This process can feel destabilizing. The ego fears losing competence, coherence, or approval. Yet what is actually being lost is dependence, not identity. As inner authority strengthens, the persona becomes less rigid. It remains functional, but it no longer dictates values. The individual can fulfill roles without being consumed by them. They can adapt without disappearing. Jung understood this shift as essential for psychological maturity. Without it, individuation stalls. The personality remains socially effective, but inwardly hollow. The false self does not collapse dramatically. It erodes quietly. Reclaiming inner authority is not a breakthrough. It is a practice of listening inwardly before responding outwardly, a practice of allowing discomfort to inform rather than control behavior, a practice of recognizing that effectiveness is not the same as truth. When this practice takes root, the ego begins to feel grounded again, not because life becomes simple, but because decisions regain weight. Inner authority does not guarantee certainty. It provides orientation, and orientation is what the psyche requires to remain whole, even in a world that demands performance. When inner authority begins to return, the persona does not disappear. It changes function. Instead of acting as a fixed identity, it becomes a negotiated boundary, a flexible interface between inner life and outer demands. This distinction is crucial. Psychological health does not come from rejecting roles, but from refusing to be possessed by them. Carl Jung emphasized that the persona is necessary precisely because society is real. Expectations exist, structures exist, consequences exist. The task is not to escape these realities, but to relate to them consciously. A negotiated boundary implies choice. The ego recognizes when adaptation is required and when it is excessive. It can ask, how much of myself needs to be expressed here, and what can remain private without being denied? This discernment restores agency. When the persona functions unconsciously, it expands automatically. It absorbs more and more of the personality until little remains outside it. When it functions consciously, it remains limited. It does its job and then steps back. This stepping back is subtle. It does not announce itself through rebellion or confession. It appears as a quiet inner freedom, the sense that one could act differently without losing oneself. People often describe this shift as relief. They still perform roles, but the roles no longer feel fused to identity. Criticism hurts less because it no longer threatens the core. Praise feels lighter because it no longer defines worth. The ego becomes less reactive. This does not mean detachment or indifference. It means proportion. The persona is no longer asked to carry emotional truth, moral certainty, or existential meaning. Those responsibilities return to inner life, where they belong. When this redistribution occurs, something important happens. Projection diminishes. The individual no longer needs others to confirm their identity constantly. They can tolerate misunderstanding without panic. Disagreement no longer feels like annihilation. Social interaction becomes more humane, less strategic, more responsive. Jung observed that people who relate consciously to their persona tend to become simpler rather than more impressive. They speak more directly. They tolerate silence. They allow moments of uncertainty to exist without rushing to fill them. This simplicity is not regression. It is integration. The persona becomes a tool rather than a shield. Boundaries clarify. Some environments are recognized as incompatible with inner life and are engaged more cautiously. Others allow greater expression. The ego learns to modulate rather than suppress. This modulation preserves energy. Energy is no longer spent maintaining an image at all costs. It is invested selectively, where adaptation serves rather than drains the psyche. Fatigue decreases not because demands vanish, but because effort becomes meaningful. A negotiated persona also allows ethical clarity. When identity is not fused with role, the individual can question expectations without collapsing. They can fulfill obligations while recognizing their limits. They can say yes without erasing themselves and no without guilt. This balance is rare because it requires ongoing attention. The persona does not remain negotiated automatically. Under stress, it tends to harden. Under threat, it expands. Under praise, it inflates. The ego must remain alert to these shifts. Jung believed that this alertness, this willingness to observe one's own adaptation, is a form of consciousness, essential to individuation. Without it, the persona gradually takes over again. With it, social life becomes less alienating. The individual no longer feels divided between who they are and who they appear to be. The gap does not disappear, but it becomes navigable. This navigability is what allows psychological life to remain dynamic rather than rigid. The persona ceases to be a prison. It becomes a doorway that can be opened or closed as needed, without fear that something essential will be lost either way. This does not resolve all tension between inner and outer life. It makes the tension workable. And when tension becomes workable, the psyche regains its capacity to move, adapt, and reorganize without fragmentation. The persona fulfills its proper function, not as identity, but as boundary. And in that role, it protects not only social belonging, but psychological integrity. Even when the persona becomes more flexible, a deeper fear often remains. It is not the fear of failure. It is not the fear of rejection in the abstract. It is the fear of being seen without the mask. Carl Jung understood this fear as one of the most persistent obstacles to psychological development. The persona does not only protect against social danger, it protects against exposure to inner truth. To loosen identification with the persona is to risk visibility not as a role, but as a person. This visibility feels dangerous because it introduces unpredictability. When the mask is intact, interactions follow familiar scripts. Expectations are known, responses are rehearsed. The ego can anticipate outcomes. Without the mask, there is no script. The individual does not know in advance how they will be received. They cannot fully control how they appear. Their reactions may surprise even themselves. This loss of control triggers anxiety. The ego often interprets this anxiety as evidence that authenticity is reckless. It concludes that the persona must be maintained at all costs, not only for social survival, but for psychological safety. Yet the anxiety points to something else. It reveals how tightly identity has been bound to performance. When the persona loosens, the ego must rely on inner authority rather than external validation. This reliance feels fragile at first because inner authority develops slowly. It does not provide instant reassurance. The fear of being seen is often strongest in those who are most competent. People who have mastered their roles have more to lose, or so it seems. Their persona has brought recognition, stability, and success. To allow cracks to show feels like sabotage. But what is feared is not exposure of weakness, it is exposure of complexity. Behind the persona lies a personality that does not fit neatly into expectations. It contains contradictions, uncertainties, unfinished qualities, and emotions that do not resolve cleanly. The ego fears that revealing this complexity will result in rejection or loss of status. In response, it maintains composure even when authenticity would be more truthful. Jung observed that this fear often leads to isolation. The individual may be surrounded by people, yet feel fundamentally unseen. Relationships remain polite, functional, or productive, but lack depth. This isolation is not caused by others. It is created by the mask itself. The persona filters what is allowed to be shown. Over time, the individual begins to believe that only the filtered version is acceptable. Everything else is hidden not because it is shameful, but because it is undefined. Undefined aspects feel dangerous because they lack social reference. The fear of being seen without the mask is therefore also a fear of groundlessness. The ego worries that without the persona, there will be nothing solid to stand on. This fear is understandable. The persona provides orientation in the social world. Without it, the ego must orient itself internally. That orientation feels uncertain because it cannot be confirmed immediately by others. Yet this uncertainty is not emptiness. It is openness. When the ego tolerates being seen imperfectly, something unexpected happens. Interactions become more reciprocal. Others respond not to performance, but to presence. Misunderstandings occur, but so do moments of genuine recognition. These moments are quieter than approval. They are also more nourishing. Jung believed that psychological life deepens only where risk is taken, not reckless risk, but the risk of allowing inner life to be partially visible. This visibility does not require confession or emotional exposure in every context. It requires honesty about limits, honesty about not knowing, honesty about uncertainty, honesty about change. When the persona allows these admissions, it stops pretending to be complete. It becomes human. The fear does not vanish immediately. It softens gradually as the ego discovers that being seen without the mask does not result in catastrophe. Some connections weaken, others strengthen. This differentiation is not loss, it is clarification. Relationships that require constant performance fall away. Relationships that tolerate complexity remain. The ego learns that belonging does not always require concealment. The persona, in this light, becomes transparent rather than opaque. It still shapes interaction, but it no longer hides inner life completely. The fear of being seen never disappears entirely. It is part of being human, but it no longer governs behavior. When the ego stops organizing life around concealment, energy returns. The psyche no longer needs to defend itself constantly. Attention shifts from maintaining appearance to engaging reality. Being seen without the mask does not guarantee acceptance. It guarantees truthfulness. And truthfulness, while less comfortable than performance, allows the psyche to breathe. The persona loosens, not because safety is guaranteed, but because inner life demands expression. And expression, even when partial, restores a sense of reality that no amount of performance can replace. When the persona dominates conscious identity, it does not merely hide inner life, actively creates a shadow. Whatever does not fit the role is pushed out of awareness. Whatever contradicts the image is excluded. Over time, this excluded material accumulates and forms what Jung called the shadow, aspects of the personality that remain alive but unacknowledged. Carl Jung emphasized that the shadow is not composed only of negative traits. It contains everything that persona could not accommodate: candor in the agreeable, ambition in the modest, vulnerability in the competent, dependency in the independent. The shadow forms not because the individual is flawed, but because adaptation requires selection. What the persona displays, the shadow absorbs. At first, this division is functional. It allows social life to proceed smoothly. But when the persona becomes rigid, the shadow grows denser. The psyche becomes polarized between what is shown and what is hidden. This polarization creates tension. The ego experiences itself as controlled, reasonable, and appropriate. The shadow carries impulses that feel excessive, inappropriate, or irrational. Because these impulses are not integrated, they appear foreign at me. This sense of foreignness is deceptive. The shadow does not belong to someone else. It belongs to the same psyche. When the ego refuses to recognize this, the shadow seeks expression indirectly. It leaks out through tone, sarcasm, overreaction, and projection. The individual criticizes in others what they cannot tolerate in themselves. The agreeable person encounters aggression everywhere. The moral person perceives corruption all around. The disciplined person resents the careless. These reactions feel justified because they are emotionally charged. Yet the charge does not originate in the situation. It originates in the shadow. Jung saw projection as the psyche's attempt to maintain balance when conscious integration fails. What cannot be admitted inwardly is encountered outwardly. The persona and shadow are therefore linked. The stronger the identification with the persona, the more autonomous the shadow becomes. The ego loses access to parts of its own vitality, and those parts return with less nuance. This is why people who are highly adapted often experience sudden eruptions of behavior that surprise even themselves. They may act impulsively, speak harshly, or violate their own values under pressure. These moments feel like loss of control. They are actually loss of relationship. The ego has lost contact with aspects of itself that demand acknowledgement. The shadow forces the encounter. Jung did not believe the solution was to act out the shadow. Acting it out merely reverses the imbalance. The task is integration, not indulgence, not suppression. Integration begins with recognition. Recognition that the traits disowned by the persona are not enemies. They are energies that were once incompatible with a role, but may now be necessary for psychological balance. Anger may signal violated boundaries. Envy may point to unlived desire. Resentment may reveal exhaustion. When these signals are dismissed, they intensify. When they are approached symbolically, they inform. The persona must soften for this to occur. A rigid persona cannot tolerate shadow material. It treats contradiction as threat. A flexible persona can hold tension. It allows the ego to admit, this is also part of me, without collapsing identity. This admission does not need to be public. It needs to be conscious. Consciousness transforms the shadow from a disruptive force into a source of information. The ego gains access to energy that was previously locked away. Behavior becomes less reactive because impulses are no longer entirely unconscious. This does not make the personality easier, it makes it truer. The integration of the shadow complicates identity. The individual becomes less predictable, less purely good, less consistently agreeable, but they also become more grounded, more resilient, and more real. Jung believed that morality without shadow awareness is fragile. It depends on repression and projection. When shadow is integrated, morality becomes reflective rather than absolute. The persona no longer needs to pretend to be complete. It can represent the individual without denying complexity. This reduces inner conflict. The psyche no longer has to split itself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. It can organize around wholeness rather than performance. The shadow does not disappear when recognized. It becomes related, and relationship not controls what prevents possession. When the ego relates to the shadow, the persona relaxes. Adaptation becomes conscious again. The personality regains elasticity. The persona fulfills its role without imprisoning the psyche. The shadow informs life without dominating it. This balance is not static. It must be renegotiated repeatedly as circumstances change. But when it is honored, the psyche no longer needs to erupt or compensate violently. It can speak in quieter ways. And quiet communication is how psychological life regains depth without losing coherence. When the persona and the shadow are not consciously related, the psyche looks for relief elsewhere. That relief often takes the form of projection. Projection occurs when aspects of the shadow are experienced not as inequalities, but as traits belonging to others. The ego remains identified with the persona, while the shadow is encountered in the social world. Carl Jung considered projection inevitable in early psychological development and dangerous when it becomes habitual. The persona presents a curated image, controlled, adapted, acceptable. The shadow carries what does not fit that image. When the ego cannot tolerate the tension between them, it resolves the conflict by externalizing it. What cannot be acknowledged inwardly is perceived outwardly. This process feels convincing because it is emotionally charged. The reaction to others feels immediate and justified. Anger, contempt, admiration, or fascination arise with intensity that seems disproportionate to the situation. These reactions reveal something important. They point to material that belongs to the psyche but has not yet been integrated. The social world becomes a mirror, not a neutral one, but a distorted one. Others appear threatening, irritating, admirable, or corrupt in ways that feel personal. The agreeable person encounters selfishness everywhere. The disciplined person is surrounded by incompetence. The modest person is haunted by arrogance. These perceptions feel accurate because they are psychologically true but not literally complete. Projection simplifies complexity. It allows the ego to maintain a clean self-image while locating contradiction outside. The persona remains intact. The shadow is carried by others. This arrangement provides temporary relief. It also creates conflict. Relationships become strained because others are unconsciously recruited to carry what the ego refuses to see. Interactions turn moralized. Differences feel intolerable. Disagreement becomes personal. The persona hardens further in response. Jung observed that projection thrives in environments where roles are rigid and identity is overdefined. When people are reduced to functionless opponents, allies, competitors, hyperactivity's projection accelerates. The psyche loses nuance. Projection also explains why some people provoke intense reactions without obvious cause. They resonate with shadow material that has not been consciously related. Attraction and aversion often arise from the same source. The person who irritates you most may embody something you have suppressed. The person you idealize may carry an unlived potential. Neither reaction is about the other alone. This does not mean perceptions are false. It means they are incomplete. The danger of projection lies not in feeling strongly, but in believing that the feeling fully describes the other. When projection dominates, the ego loses curiosity. It stops asking questions and starts making judgments. This loss of curiosity is a sign that inner dialogue has been replaced by outer conflict. Reducing projection does not mean suppressing reaction. It means turning attention inward at the moment of intensity. Why does this affect me so strongly? What does this reaction protect? What part of me feels threatened or fascinated? These questions restore complexity. As projection is withdrawn, the persona loosens. The ego no longer needs to maintain moral superiority or emotional distance. Others are allowed to be complex rather than symbolic carriers. This withdrawal is gradual. Projection is deeply ingrained because it simplifies life. It provides clear enemies and heroes. It stabilizes identity by contrast. But simplicity comes at a cost. When projection dominates, relationships become repetitive. The same conflicts reappear with different people. The ego feels perpetually misunderstood or provoked. Jung believed that individuation requires reclaiming projection, not eliminating it, but recognizing it as a signal that something within demands attention. As projection diminishes, the persona becomes less defensive. The ego can tolerate ambiguity. Differences no longer threaten identity. Social life becomes less dramatic, more realistic. This realism is not cynicism. It is maturity. The individual no longer expects others to complete, validate, or oppose their identity. They meet others as persons rather than screens. The persona remains in place, but it becomes more transparent. It no longer needs to hide contradiction. It can allow uncertainty without collapsing. This shift does not produce harmony everywhere. Some relationships change, some tensions persist, but the nature of conflict transforms. It becomes specific rather than symbolic. Projection had inflated the stakes. Integration reduces them. When the persona and shadow are held in conscious relationship, the psyche no longer needs to fight itself through others. The social world ceases to be a battleground for inner conflict. It becomes a field of encounter. An encounter, unlike projection, allows reality to speak back. This is where psychological life begins to regain depth, not through isolation, but through more honest relation. Relation grounded not in performance, but in awareness. And awareness is what allows the persona to serve life without distorting it. When the persona is no longer mistaken for identity, psychological life enters a different phase. This phase is quieter, less dramatic, less performative, and for that reason, it is often misunderstood. Carl Jung did not associate maturity with confidence, charisma, or certainty. He associated it with containing the capacity to hold inner contradiction without resolving it prematurely. Beyond the mask, the ego no longer needs to prove itself constantly. It does not abandon roles, but it stops seeking validation through them. The persona becomes functional rather than compensatory. This shift is subtle. The individual still fulfills responsibilities. They still adapt to context. They still participate in social life. But something essential has changed. Identity is no longer at stake in every interaction. Criticism no longer feels annihilating. Praise no longer feels intoxicating. Misunderstanding no longer demands correction. This does not mean indifference. It means proportion. The ego has discovered that it exists independently of performance. This discovery does not inflate it, it stabilizes it. Jung believed that much of modern psychological suffering comes from confusing social success with psychological maturity. A person may appear accomplished while remaining inwardly dependent on approval. Conversely, someone may appear unremarkable while possessing a strong inner orientation. Maturity beyond the mask is not visible at first glance. It reveals itself in restraint, in listening rather than reacting, in choosing silence where performance would once have appeared. The persona still speaks, but it no longer dominates. One of the clearest signs of this maturity is the ability to tolerate being ordinary. The ego no longer needs to be exceptional to feel real. It can accept limits without shame. It can occupy roles without becoming them. It can change without collapsing into self-doubt. This ordinariness is not resignation. It is freedom from inflation. When identity is no longer bound to image, energy is released. That energy does not necessarily seek achievement. It often seeks depth attention to relationships, creativity without audience, work without exhibition. Jung saw this shift frequently in the second half of life, though it can occur earlier. The psyche withdraws its fascination with appearance and redirects it toward meaning. Meaning here does not announce itself loudly. It appears as necessity rather than ambition, as commitment rather than excitement, as alignment rather than recognition. Beyond the mask, choices are guided less by how they appear and more by how they resonate inwardly. The ego trusts its orientation even when outcomes are uncertain. This trust is not blind. It is earned through repeated encounters with inner life. The persona, once a shield, becomes transparent. It still mediates between self and world, but it no longer filters out complexity. The individual can acknowledge doubt, ambivalence, and limitation without feeling diminished. This acknowledgement deepens relationships. Others no longer feel like audiences. They feel like participants. The need to impress fades. The need to dominate fades. What remains is presents a quality that cannot be manufactured or displayed deliberately. Presence is felt, not performed. Jung believed that presence arises when the ego stops trying to secure its image and begins to inhabit its experience fully. This inhabitation requires humility. It accepts that the self is not finished, not fully knowable, not finally defined. The mask promised clarity. Maturity accepts ambiguity. This acceptance does not weaken the personality. It strengthens it. The ego becomes less brittle, more adaptably. It no longer breaks under contradiction. Beyond the mask, the psyche is not unified into a single image. It is held together through relationships between ego and inner life, between role and reality, between appearance and becoming. This holding is work. It must be renewed continuously, especially under pressure. The persona will always be tempted to harden, to simplify, to protect identity through performance. Maturity does not eliminate this temptation. It recognizes it, and recognition is enough to prevent possession. The persona remains a necessary interface with the world, but it no longer defines the person who wears it. Identity becomes layered rather than singular, flexible rather than fixed, grounded rather than displayed. This is not the disappearance of the mask. It is the end of mistaking the mask for the face, and that distinction once made cannot be fully undone. The ego remembers what it means to exist beyond appearance, and that remembrance changes how life is lived, even when the same roles remain in place. At the end of this movement, the task is no longer to expose the persona or dismantle it. The task is to live with it consciously. Carl Jung understood that the persona never disappears. As long as there is society, there will be roles. As long as there is relationship, there will be adaptation. Psychological health does not require purity from masks. It requires non-identification. The danger is not wearing the mask. The danger is forgetting that you are wearing it. When the ego remembers this, something stabilizing occurs. Life becomes less dramatic, not because conflict ends, but because conflict is no longer personalized unnecessarily. Tension is experienced as part of reality rather than as a threat to identity. The persona becomes lighter. You can fulfill expectations without being consumed by them. You can play roles without disappearing into them. You can be misunderstood without rushing to correct the image. This lightness is not carelessness. It is psychological weight redistribution. The ego no longer carries the burden of representing the whole personality to the world. Inner life is allowed to remain partially hidden, not out of fear, but out of respect for its complexity. Not everything must be expressed. Not everything must be shared. Not everything must be turned into identity. Jung believed that much suffering arises from the compulsion to make the inner world immediately visible, legible, and acceptable. This compulsion belongs to the persona, not to the psyche as a whole. The psyche moves at its own pace. When the ego allows inner life to unfold privately, without forcing translation into social terms, something essential is preserved. Depth remains possible. Reflection deepens. Meaning matures. The persona in this arrangement becomes a container rather than a filter. It holds the individual in the world without distorting what lives beneath. It allows participation without performance, becoming identity. This containment makes contradiction tolerable. You can be competent and uncertain, committed and questioning, visible and inwardly complex. These contradictions no longer require resolution. They are held rather than eliminated. Living this way demands vigilance. Under pressure, the ego will be tempted to collapse back into the mass. It will seek safety, incoherence, approval, and clarity. This temptation never disappears. Psychological maturity does not remove regression. It recognizes it early. Recognition prevents possession. When the ego notices that it is slipping into performance, it can pause. When it notices that identity is being defended too aggressively, it can step back. When it notices exhaustion returning, it can ask what inner life has been neglected. These pauses are small, they are also decisive. They prevent the persona from hardening again into a false center. Jung believed that individuation does not culminate in a final state. It remains a process, one that unfolds through repeated negotiations between inner truth and outer necessity. The persona is where this negotiation becomes visible. To live well is not to abandon the mask, nor to perfect it, but to keep it permeable. To allow inner life to influence outer action without demanding total transparency or constant authenticity. Authenticity, when demanded, becomes another role. True integration is quieter. It shows itself in restraint, in listening, in the ability to say less and mean more. The persona remains, but it no longer dominates attention. Life is no longer organized around image maintenance. Energy flows inward and outward without obstruction. The ego stands where it belongs, not as performer, not as illusion, but as participant. Participant in the psyche that is larger, deeper, and more complex than any role can express. This participation does not make life easier. It makes it inhabitable. When the mask is worn without becoming the face, the psyche regains balance. Outer life continues. Inner life deepens. Neither needs to erase the other. The persona fulfills its purpose and steps aside. And in that space between appearance and essence, psychological life becomes real again.